Clara Whitmore smoothed her last good dress with both hands, stepped off that train, and looked down the platform for a prosperous rancher, and found a man with torn sleeves, a mud-caked wagon, and eyes that hadn't held hope in years. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She picked up her trunk, walked toward him, and said, "You lied in that letter." He looked at her boots, then at her face, and said, "So did you. If you've ever built something real from nothing, subscribe. Stay until the end, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels." The letter had arrived on a Tuesday. Clara Whitmore had read it 4 times at the kitchen table of her cousin Dorothea's cramped apartment in St. Louis, where the wallpaper was peeling and the smell of boiled cabbage had soaked into every curtain and floorboard. She read it 4 times, not because the words were beautiful, but because she needed them to be true. "I am a cattleman of some prosperity in the Montana Territory. I am seeking a wife of sound constitution and willing spirit. The ranch is established and the land is good. I am a man of my word, and I do not waste time on pretense. Ethan Cole." That was his name. 2 sentences of self-description. 1 line about the land and a postal address. Clara had folded the letter carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and looked out the window at the street below, where 2 boys were fighting over a bread crust in the gutter. She had written back the same afternoon. "I am a woman of education and capable disposition. I keep a clean household, manage accounts with precision, and adapt well to new circumstances. I am not afraid of hard work." Not 1 word of it was a lie exactly. She had managed her father's household accounts when his mind began to go. She had kept things clean. She was educated, genuinely educated, with 3 years of schooling that most women of her circle would have envied. But she had never milked a cow in her life. She had never baked bread from scratch, never hauled water from a well, never started a fire without a matchbook and someone nearby to tell her she was doing it correctly. What Clara Whitmore had was this pride, desperation, and a bone-deep refusal to become a burden to people who already resented carrying her. Her father's import business had collapsed 2 years before. The debts had eaten the house, then the furniture, then every last piece of her mother's jewelry, except a plain silver ring Clara wore on her right hand because she could not bring herself to sell it. Dorothea had taken her in with tight-lipped Christian charity that made Clara feel like a stain on a good tablecloth every single morning she woke beneath Dorothea's roof. She was 27 years old. She was not going to spend the next 40 years being a stain. So when Ethan Cole's letter arrived through the matrimonial correspondence service, Clara had seen it for what it was, a door. An imperfect door in an imperfect wall, but a door nonetheless. She had walked through it. The train ride to Montana took 4 days. Clara sat upright for most of it, watching the landscape change through the window, the flat farmlands of Missouri giving way to the open grasslands of the territories, the sky growing wider and wilder until it felt almost threatening, like a thing that could swallow you if you weren't careful. She had brought 1 trunk, 1 hat box, and 1 small leather satchel with 3 books inside. She had left everything else behind because there was nothing else left. On the last morning, she put on her blue traveling dress. It was the finest thing she still owned, silk-fronted deep blue, fitted at the waist, with a collar she had mended twice, but mended well. She pinned her hair carefully. She straightened her back. She told herself, "Whatever he is, you are still Clara Whitmore. You walk in there with your head up." The train pulled into the station at Harlan Crossing, a town so small it barely deserved the name, just after noon. Clara stepped onto the platform and looked. She had imagined many things. A well-dressed man waiting beside a good horse. Perhaps a buggy. Perhaps flowers, though she hadn't let herself hope for that. At minimum, a man who looked like he owned something. What she found was a wagon with a cracked wheel held together with rope and stubbornness. What she found was a sack of flour in the wagon bed, tied so sloppily that half of it had already dusted white across the boards. What she found was a man standing at the edge of the platform with his hat pulled so low she almost couldn't see his eyes. How was tall? That she registered first. Broad through the shoulders, lean everywhere else, with the kind of sun-darkened skin that came from years of outdoor labor, not leisure. His shirt was clean, but the right sleeve was torn at the elbow and repaired badly with thread that didn't match. His boots were good boots, once she could tell by the cut, but they'd been resoled at least twice, and were currently coated in a layer of dried mud that suggested the road from his ranch was not a pleasant one. Hal was looking at her the same way she was looking at him. Like something had gone very wrong somewhere. Clara picked up her trunk herself before he could decide whether or not to help. She carried it to the edge of the platform steps and stopped. "Mr. Cole," she said. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Your letter said you owned a thriving ranch." He looked at the wagon. He looked back at her. Something passed across his face that was not quite guilt and not quite shame, but lived somewhere in the county between them. "It thrives," he said, "when it rains." Clara looked at the sky. Cloudless. Blazing. Montana in July with not a drop of mercy in sight. "I see," she said. She walked down the steps, loaded her own trunk into the wagon bed beside the flour sack, and climbed up onto the bench without assistance. After a moment, Ethan Cole climbed up beside her. He picked up the reins. He did not apologize. Clara decided she respected that, even as she hated it. The ride to the ranch took 2 hours on a road that was less a road than a suggestion of 1-2 ruts in the dry grass worn down by wagon wheels over years of use, cutting through a landscape that was beautiful in the way. Wild things were beautiful, indifferent to you, going on perfectly well, without you, not particularly concerned whether you lived or died. Neither of them spoke for the first hour. Clara watched the land and catalogued her situation with the same methodical calm she had used to catalog her father's debts. She had almost nothing. She had married a stranger. She was in a territory she had never visited, on her way to a ranch she had never seen, to a life she had never lived. She had made this choice with her eyes open. That was the only thing she had left to hold on to. She had chosen this. Nobody had forced her hand. "How many cattle?" she finally asked. Ethan kept his eyes on the road. 43 head. The letter implied considerably more. The letter implied a lot of things. Clara turned to look at him directly. He didn't turn back. "Do you have a cook?" she asked. A pause. "I had a ranch hand. He left last spring." "That isn't what I asked." Another pause longer. "No," he said. "I don't have a cook." Clara looked forward at the road. "Your letter said you were seeking a wife of willing spirit." "That's right. I would like to clarify," she said quietly. "That willing spirit is not the same thing as culinary expertise." For the first time, Ethan Cole turned to look at her. She kept her profile still, her chin level, her eyes on the horizon. "Are you saying you can't cook?" he asked. "I'm saying," Clara replied with extreme precision, "that my skills in that particular area have considerable room for development." The silence that followed was long enough that Clara began to wonder if he would simply turn the wagon around. He didn't. "Well," he said finally. "Mine too." The cabin was exactly what the wagon had promised it would be. It leaned slightly to the left, as though it had once tried to lie down and changed its mind halfway through. The roof was good, that she noticed first, because a bad roof meant everything else was ruined. But the porch steps had a broken board. The window on the east side had been patched with oilcloth instead of glass, and the door fit its frame imperfectly enough that daylight showed around the edges. Inside, a table, 2 chairs, a stove that had clearly been arguing with itself for years. A shelf with 4 mismatched cups, 3 cracked plates, and a pan with a handle wired back on. A pantry that contained dried beans, a hard nub of salt, something in a jar. She didn't examine too closely, and a smell that suggested the previous supply of something had gone bad and been removed, but not forgotten. Against the far wall, 1 bed and a curtain hung on a rope, dividing it from the rest of the room. Clara stood in the center of the cabin and looked at all of it. Ethan stood in the doorway and looked at her. "It needs work," he said. "Yes," she agreed. It's been just me, for a while." "How long?" He shifted his weight. 4 years. Clara turned to face him. "Mr. Cole, I want to be plain with you because I think we've had enough letters." He met her eyes. Waited. "I came here because I had nothing left in St. Louis, and I was not willing to spend the rest of my life depending on other people's charity." You advertised for a wife of capable disposition, and I advertised myself as one. The exact degree of my capability is—" She paused. "Subject to ongoing development. If that is not acceptable to you, I understand. But I will tell you this. I am not afraid of hard work. I am not afraid of this land. And I am not a woman who runs from a thing simply because it is more difficult than she expected." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. His jaw worked once. "What can you do?" he asked. Clara thought honestly. "I can read. I can write. I can do sums quickly and accurately. I can organize things. I can negotiate. I once talked a creditor down from $800 to $450 without losing my temper or my dignity. I can learn whatever you have patience to teach. Can you ride?" "I have ridden on several occasions." "These aren't leisure horses, Miss Whitmore. I assumed as much." He pushed off the doorframe and came fully into the cabin. He picked up his hat, turned it in his hands once, and set it on the table. "I'll teach you," he said. "Everything you need to know to survive here. You'll learn or you won't. I can't carry you on top of everything else. But I'll teach." "That is all I'm asking," Clara said. He nodded once, decisive. Like a man who had made a business deal he wasn't entirely sure about, but intended to honor regardless. "Supper," he said. "You want to start there?" Clara looked at the stove. The stove looked back at her with deep skepticism. "I suppose we have to eat," she said. The biscuits were catastrophic. Clara had watched her mother's cook make biscuits 100 times as a child. She remembered the movements, the cutting of fat into flour, the adding of liquid, the folding, the cutting. But remembering was not the same as knowing. And knowing was not the same as doing. And doing, it turned out, was an entirely separate discipline that did not respond well to confidence, unsupported by practice. The first batch came out of the stove black on the bottom and raw in the middle. The second batch, she had found more flour, tried again with grim determination, came out uniformly dense, small, and with the approximate texture of something you might use to fill a gap in a wall. Ethan ate them anyway. He ate them without comment, without expression, with the focused determination of a man who had decided he was eating supper, and the quality of supper was not going to be part of the conversation. Clara watched him eat the second biscuit. "They're terrible," she said. "They're food," he said. "They are barely food." "They're what's for supper." He looked up. "You don't have to apologize for them." "I'm not apologizing. I'm making an honest assessment." Something shifted almost imperceptibly around his eyes. Not quite amusement. The shadow of it, maybe. "Fair enough," he said. Clara ate her own biscuit. It was as assessed terrible, and drank her coffee, which she had managed correctly, and looked at the cracked plate in front of her, and the oilcloth window, and the curtain on the rope dividing the room. She did not cry at the table. She would not give the room the satisfaction. Later, when the lamp was low and Ethan had gone out to check the stock and she was alone in the cabin, Clara sat on the edge of the bed on her side of the curtain and let herself feel the full weight of what she had done. She had traveled 1,400 miles to marry a man she did not know in a place she had never been. She had walked into a cabin that leaned, and a pantry that was nearly empty, and a life that bore no resemblance to the one she had constructed from 2 paragraphs of a letter. She had burned the biscuits. She pressed her hands flat on her knees and breathed. "You chose," she told herself. "You chose this with your eyes open." But choosing a thing and living inside it were 2 different exercises, and she was only just now arriving at the second one. She could hear Ethan outside, the soft sound of his voice, low and steady, the way men talk to horses and cattle when they thought nobody was listening. Something about that sound steadied her more than she expected. He was still here. She was still here. The cabin was still standing, more or less. The country was not what she expected. The man was not what she expected. But she thought she was almost certain that she was not what he expected either. Clara looked at the curtain, then at the wall, then at the black square of window where the oilcloth let through the faintest thread of night air. She straightened her spine. She had burned the biscuits tonight. She would not burn them tomorrow, and she would not burn them the day after that. She would learn this stove. She would learn this land. She would learn what it meant to live in a place that offered no comfort unless you made it yourself, from whatever you had, with whatever strength you could bring to it on any given morning. She was Clara Whitmore. She had talked a creditor down to $450 without losing her composure. She could learn to make a biscuit. Outside, Ethan's voice went quiet. She heard his boots on the porch steps. The good board then around the broken one, and then the door swung open with that imperfect fit that let in the night air and the sound of wind moving through the grass for miles and miles in every direction. He came in. He didn't look at her side of the curtain. She didn't look at his. "Good night, Mr. Cole," Clara said. A pause. "Good night, Miss Whitmore," he said. The lamp went out. Montana dark, pressed in from all sides, deep and absolute. The kind of dark that didn't exist in cities that had weight and mass and silence wrapped up inside it. Clara lay back on the bed fully dressed, her hands folded on her stomach, and stared up at the ceiling she couldn't see. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow you start. And she meant it. She burned the oatmeal the next morning. Not badly, not the catastrophic black ruin of the biscuits, but enough that the bottom of the pot scorched and the whole cabin filled with a smell that was not entirely appetizing. Clara scraped what she could into 2 bowls, added the last of the sugar, and set Ethan's portion on the table before he came in from the morning chores. He came in. He looked at the bowl. He sat down and ate it. "The bottom caught," Clara said. "I noticed. The stove runs hotter on the left side than the right. You should have told me that." Ethan looked up from his bowl. "I didn't think about it." "Think about it now," she said. "What else does this stove do that I should know?" He blinked. It was the look of a man who had never been asked to explain the things he simply knew from years of living with them. He set down his spoon. He thought, "Damper sticks in wet weather. You have to force it or the smoke backs up. The front left burner runs the hottest. If you're baking, you want the coals banked to the right and the door cracked a finger's width, not more." Clara was already at the shelf, where she had placed her small satchel the night before. She took out a pencil and the back pages of one of her books and wrote it all down. Ethan watched her write. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Taking notes," she said. "Tell me everything else." He told her. About the well, the rope had a fray 3 feet from the bucket needed watching. About the cow, a broad roan named Margaret, who would not cooperate with milking unless you spoke it to her first, which Ethan did with evident private embarrassment, and which Clara filed away without comment. About the 2 horses which fence posts were loose, which section of roof needed watching when it rained. He talked for 20 minutes straight, which she suspected was more words than he normally produced in a full week. Clara wrote down every word. When he finished, she looked at her notes, looked at him and said, "All right, teach me the cow first." Margaret the cow had strong opinions and no patience for incompetence. Clara learned this within 30 seconds of entering the barn stall with a pail and more confidence than the situation warranted. The cow turned her large brown head, assessed. Clara, with the flat contempt of an animal that had seen a great many humans and found most of them wanting, and then stepped directly sideways onto Clara's foot. Clara did not scream. She made a sound that was not quite a word, and was not quite anything else, and she removed her foot from beneath Margaret's considerable weight, and she straightened up, and she said through her teeth, "Good morning to you too." Ethan was leaning against the stall post. He said nothing, but she saw his jaw move. "You're laughing," she said. "I'm not," he said. His jaw moved again. "Ethan Cole, if you laugh at me, I will pour this pail over your head, and you will deserve every drop of it." He pressed his lips together. Something happened to his eyes. They went briefly warm in a way she hadn't seen before, and he pushed off the post and came into the stall. "You have to talk to her," he said. "I am not going to talk to a cow. Then you're not going to get any milk." He moved to Margaret's left side, laid a hand along her flank, and said in a low conversational tone, "Morning, Margaret. You're going to behave today. We've got someone new learning. You be decent about it." Margaret exhaled through her nose, settled. Clara stared. "You're serious," she said. "Works every time." He stepped back. "Your turn." Clara looked at the cow. The cow looked straight ahead, with the dignified indifference of royalty. Clara cleared her throat. "Good morning, Margaret," she said, feeling profoundly ridiculous. "I am Clara Whitmore. I am new here. I would appreciate your cooperation." Margaret did not step on her foot. Clara took that as consent, crouched down, and began to learn. It took her 4 days to get the rhythm right. 4 mornings of crouching in that stall with her back aching and her hands cramping, and Margaret periodically expressing her editorial opinions through a variety of bovine signals that required quick reflexes to avoid. By the 4th morning, Clara was producing a full pail of clean milk with something approaching efficiency. She brought the pail to the cabin porch where Ethan was mending harness and set it down in front of him without a word. He looked at the pail. He looked at her. Her hair was coming out of its pins. Her dress had a new stain on the left knee, and she was holding herself with the contained satisfaction of a woman who had just won an argument with God. "Full pail," he said. "Full pail," she confirmed. He nodded once slowly. "Good," he said. It was not a compliment exactly. It was better than a compliment. It was an acknowledgement, one working person to another, that a thing had been done correctly. Clara carried the pail inside and felt something warm and unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not happiness precisely. Something quieter and more durable than happiness. Something that felt cautiously like competence. The bread took longer. She ruined 6 batches before she produced one that Ethan ate without his jaw tightening in the way she'd learned meant he was working to keep his face neutral. The failures accumulated in a line of private humiliation, too dense, too flat, not risen over risen, and then collapsed a texture she could only describe as geological. She threw the 4th batch out behind the barn rather than serve it, and stood in the dirt for a moment with her hands on her hips, looking at the sky, asking it silently what precisely she was doing wrong. The sky offered no technical advice. She went back inside and tried again. What changed on the 7th attempt was not a revelation, but an accumulation. All the small observations she had been cataloging, all the notes in the back of her book, all the adjustments made and failed and adjusted again, finally arriving at something that was more instinct than instruction. She felt the dough differently under her hands. She knew without being told when the heat in the stove was right. When she pulled that batch from the oven, the smell was entirely different. Ethan came in from outside and stopped in the middle of the cabin. He stood there for a moment, just breathing. "That's bread," he said. "Yes," said Clara. "It is." He sat down at the table. She cut him a piece. He ate it slowly with the care of a man trying not to finish it too fast. "Where'd you learn?" he asked. "I failed my way here," she said honestly. He looked at her across the table. "That's how most things worth knowing get learned," he said. Clara said nothing, but she cut him another piece. The women in town were another education entirely. The first time Clara went into Harlan Crossing alone, Ethan had gone to the feed store. She had the grocery list. They agreed to meet at the wagon. In an hour, she walked into the general store and encountered 3 women who stopped their conversation with the clean precision of people who had been talking about something they didn't want her to hear. The storekeeper was a heavy-set man named Mr. Pruitt, who looked at her with the careful neutrality of someone trying to determine which side of a fence to land on. "Mrs. Cole," he said. "Mr. Pruitt, I need salt pork, dried beans, a length of cotton muslin, and whatever you have in the way of baking soda." She set her list on the counter. One of the women, tall, thin, with a mouth like a closed purse, spoke from the side of the store. "You're the mail-order bride." Clara turned. "I'm Clara Cole, and you are Eleanor Voss. My husband owns the Voss grazing land north of your of Cole's ranch." A pause waited with meaning. "I heard you came expecting quite a different situation." "Most people find life differs from their expectations," Clara said pleasantly. "I imagine that's true for all of us." "I heard Ethan's ranch is in trouble," said the second woman, younger, with the avid expression of someone who collected other people's difficulties like pressed flowers. "I heard Victor Harlan's been after those water rights for 2 years." Clara had not heard the name Victor Harlan before that moment. She filed it immediately and gave nothing away. "I'm sure my husband manages his own business admirably," she said, and turned back to Mr. Pruitt. "The salt pork, please." And do you have any vanilla extract? I've been working on improving my baking. Eleanor Voss made a sound that was almost a laugh, but chose to be something more cutting instead. You don't know how to bake. I do now, Clara said. I burned 6 batches before I got it right. But I got it right. She met Eleanor Voss's eyes without blinking. I find that's generally how it works. She paid for her goods, took her parcel, and walked out of the general store with her back straight and her chin level and her heart hammering so hard behind her ribs that she could feel it in her fingertips. She had not. She decided on the walk back to the wagon, given Eleanor Voss a single inch. She intended to continue not giving Eleanor Voss a single inch. What Clara had not expected was what she learned when she got home that afternoon. She asked Ethan about Victor Harlan at supper directly, no preamble, the way she'd learned he responded best. Ethan went very still. Where'd you hear that name? He asked. The general store. Mrs. Voss mentioned him in connection with water rights. A long pause. Ethan put down his fork. He looked at the table, then out the oilcloth window, then finally at her. Creek runs through the back pasture, he said. Victor Harlan owns the land to the east. He's been trying to get that water access for 3 years. Offered to buy the strip of land the creek runs through. And you refused. It's my land. Without that water I've got nothing. The cattle can't survive a dry summer without it. What did he do after you refused? Another pause, this one longer and harder. Started talking, Ethan said. To the bank, to the county assessor, suggesting my property value wasn't what I had it assessed at, suggesting my deed might have irregularities. His voice stayed flat, but his hand on the table was not flat. It had closed slowly into something that wasn't quite a fist. Nothing he can prove, nothing I can prove against him yet. But he's patient. Victor Harlan is a very patient man. Clara looked at his hand, then at his face. Do you have your deed papers? She asked. What? The property deed, the original land certificate, any correspondence with the county assessor's office. Do you have them? Ethan looked at her like she'd said something in a language he recognized but hadn't expected to hear. They're in the box under the bed. Get them, Clara said. Why? Because I do sums quickly and accurately, I manage accounts with precision, and I would like to see exactly what we're dealing with. The silence between them had a different quality now. Not uncomfortable. Something more like the moment before a decision. Ethan got up. He came back with a battered tin box and set it on the table between them. Clara opened it. Inside the land deed filed, 1878. 3 letters from the county assessor's office, 2 of them recent. A loan document from the Harlan Crossing Bank. She noted the name of the bank without expression, and a handwritten note. She didn't ask about that, appeared to be in a woman's handwriting, which she set aside face down without reading. She read everything else. She read slowly, with the focused attention she had once applied to her father's collapsing accounts. Finding the architecture beneath the numbers, the shape of what was real and what was distortion. Ethan sat across the table and watched her read. He did not rush her. After 40 minutes, Clara set the last document down and looked up. Your deed is sound, she said. The land assessment complaint Harlan filed with the county was made on the basis of a survey that your original certificate predates by 6 years. His claim is that your water access was never legally established, but this, she touched the deed. This language here in the 3rd paragraph establishes riparian rights explicitly as part of the original land grant. He knows that, which means he's hoping you don't. Ethan stared at her. Say that again, he said. Victor Harlan is betting that you don't know your own deed well enough to defend it. The language establishing your right to that creek water is here, has been here since 1878, and is legally sound. He cannot take it from you through the assessor's office. What he can do is pressure the bank. The bank holds my operating loan, Ethan said slowly. I know. And the bank is called the Harlan Crossing Bank. The silence that fell then was the kind that had weight. His family founded the town, Ethan said. I gathered. Clara tapped the deed with one finger. We need a copy of this made kept somewhere other than this cabin. And I want to write to the Territorial Land Office in Helena directly, not through the county assessor directly. There are procedures for confirming existing land grants that bypass the local assessment process entirely. Ethan was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. It wasn't gratitude exactly. It was something more unsettled than gratitude, the look of a man who had been carrying something heavy and alone for a long time and had just discovered without expecting it that someone else had placed their hands underneath it. "You know how to do that," he said. "Write to the territorial office." "I know how to write a letter that gets read," Clara said, "which is in my experience the more important skill." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Why are you doing this?" Clara looked at him steadily. "Because it's my ranch too," she said. "We made a legal arrangement, Mr. Cole. I intend to hold up my end of it. All of it." Something moved in his face, something that closed and then opened like a door testing its own hinges. "Ethan," he said. She looked at him. "My name is Ethan," he said. "You keep saying Mr. Cole." A beat. "All right," said Clara. "Ethan." He picked up his fork, went back to supper. But the set of his shoulders was different. Some fraction of the chronic tension he carried had shifted, redistributed, as though it had found somewhere else to sit. Clara pulled the deed back toward her and began drafting the letter to Helena in the margins of her notebook. She wrote for a long time after he went to bed. The days hardened her hands. She noticed this one morning wringing out a cloth the way her palms had changed, the skin toughened in new places, the blisters that had come and healed and come again until they stopped coming. She stood in the thin morning light and looked at her hands like she was looking at something that belonged to a person she hadn't quite met yet. She had ridden twice now. Real riding, not the gentle ambles of her St. Louis acquaintance, but working ranch riding across uneven ground on a horse named Calico, who had very little sentimentality and required her absolute attention at all times. The first time she'd come back, she could barely walk for 2 days and had said nothing about it to Ethan. The second time was better. The third time, she forgot to think about the pain entirely, because she was too occupied with where Calico was putting her feet along the creek bank. That was the morning she had understood something important. The land did not care whether she was comfortable. The land was simply itself enormous and indifferent and demanding, and the only thing it respected was presence. Showing up, doing the work, not leaving. She had not left. She woke every morning before dawn. She started the fire correctly now, consistently, while Ethan was still in the barn. She had the coffee ready by the time he came in, and she went out to Margaret while the coffee cooled, and she came back with the milk, and she made whatever breakfast the pantry allowed, and she sat down at the table across from a man who was not what the letter had promised, in a life that was not what she had hoped for. And she ate her meal and planned her day and got on with it. It was not the life she had imagined. She was slowly realizing the most real life she had ever lived. The moment everything shifted between them happened on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after she'd arrived, and it happened over a coat. Ethan's work coat had a tear along the right shoulder seam that had been getting worse for what looked like months. The thread pulling out in a long, unraveling line that would take the whole shoulder with it before much longer. Clara had noticed it the first week. She had not said anything. She simply took the coat one evening while Ethan was out, found his sewing kit, a sad little tin with 3 needles and 2 colors of thread, neither of them quite right, and she repaired it. She used small tight stitches, the kind her mother's seamstress had once shown her when Clara was 12 and thought sewing was beneath her. She reinforced the seam twice. She used the brown thread which was closer to the coat's color, and she worked carefully in the lamplight until the shoulder was sound again. She folded the coat and put it back on its hook. She said nothing about it. The next morning, Ethan put on the coat and stopped. He ran his hand over the shoulder. He turned and looked at her back. She was at the stove keeping her face toward the coffee, and she felt him look. He didn't say anything either, but that evening after supper, he got up without explanation and went out to the barn. He came back 20 minutes later, carrying something, a rough pine board sanded smooth with 2 brackets fashioned from bent iron. He set it against the wall near the window where Clara had been stacking her books in an unstable pile on the floor. He mounted it to the wall. He stepped back. "For your books," he said. Clara looked at the shelf. It was not beautiful. The board was uneven on one end, and the brackets were handmade and showed it. But the wood was smooth, and it was solid, and he had sanded it himself and put it up without being asked. She didn't trust her voice for a moment. "Thank you," she said when she did. He nodded, sat back down, picked up the harness he'd been mending. Clara moved her books to the shelf one by one and arranged them in the order she preferred, and did not let herself think too hard about what it meant that he had noticed she needed something and made it without ceremony or acknowledgement or any expectation of thanks. She thought about it anyway. She thought about it for a long time. Victor Harlan came to the ranch on a Thursday. Clara saw him first from the window, a heavy-set man in a good coat, riding a horse that cost more than anything on their property, flanked by a man Clara didn't recognize, who wore the careful expression of someone being paid to look large and say nothing. She went to the door. "Ethan," she called. Her voice was even. "You have a visitor." Ethan came out of the barn. He saw Victor Harlan, and something happened to his face, a closing off, a bracing, the expression of a man who had been through this particular conversation too many times and found it expensive every time. Harlan rode up to the porch and didn't dismount. Clara noticed that. The calculation in it, staying on horseback to keep the height advantage, to imply that this visit wasn't worth getting down for. "Cole," he said. Then his eyes moved to Clara, with the assessing look of a man pricing something. "Mrs. Cole, didn't expect to find you still here." "I live here," Clara said. "So you do." He smiled, a broad, easy smile that had done a lot of work over the years and knew it. "Ethan, I'm going to make this simple. The bank is reviewing its outstanding loans this quarter. I've heard there's some concern about the Cole Ranch's viability. I'm in a position to purchase the East Pasture Creek included at a fair price. Would save you a lot of difficulty." "No," Ethan said. "Cole." "The answer hasn't changed, Harlan. It won't change." Harlan's smile stayed exactly where it was, which told Clara it wasn't a real smile. She had seen enough negotiation in her father's business to know the difference between a man who was smiling because things were going well and a man who was smiling because he had other options he hadn't mentioned yet. She stepped forward to stand beside Ethan. "Mr. Harlan," she said, "my husband's deed establishes riparian rights to that creek explicitly in the 1878 land grant. We've already been in correspondence with the Territorial Land Office in Helena regarding the existing grant confirmation. I expect we'll have their response within the month." She kept her voice pleasant. "If you have specific concerns about the property's assessment, I'd encourage you to raise them through the appropriate territorial channels. We'd welcome the clarity." Harlan looked at her. Something in his smile became slightly less comfortable. "You've been busy, Mrs. Cole," he said. "I have," she agreed. "This is my ranch. I tend to be thorough about things that belong to me." A pause, long enough to mean something. "Give it some thought, Ethan," Harlan said. He pulled his horse's head around. "The offer won't stay open forever." He rode out. The hired man followed without ever having said a single word. Clara and Ethan stood on the porch until the sound of hooves faded. Then Ethan said quietly, "You wrote to Helena." 3 weeks ago. I told you I would." "I didn't think I thought it was an idea. I didn't know you'd already done it." Clara looked at him. "When I say I'm going to do a thing," she said, "I do it." Ethan turned to look at her. Really look, the kind of looking that had nothing to do with sizing someone up and everything to do with actually seeing them. "I believe you," he said. It was not a declaration. It was not a romantic statement. It was a man who had been lied to and disappointed enough times that belief itself had become a scarce and carefully rationed resource, and he was extending some of it quietly without ceremony. Clara held it carefully. "Good," she said. "Now come inside. The bread's done and I'm not letting it go cold." He followed her inside, and the door, with its imperfect fit and its thread of daylight around the edges, swung shut behind them both. The letter from Helena arrived on a Friday morning 6 weeks after Clara had sent hers. She was at the table working through the ranch accounts, a ledger she had started herself, transferring Ethan's scattered notes and receipts into something that had shape and logic and could be read by someone other than the man who'd made the original mess, when she heard the wagon on the road and looked up. Ethan came in holding the envelope like it might bite him. "It's from the Territorial Land Office," he said. Clara set down her pencil. She held out her hand. I gave it to her without argument, which told her more about where things stood between them than almost anything else had. 4 weeks ago, he would have opened it himself. Read it alone, decided what to tell her. Now he handed it across the table and waited. She opened it carefully. Read it once fast, then again slow. Then she set it down and looked at him. Your riparian rights are confirmed, she said. The Territorial Land Office has registered the original 1878 grant language as legally establishing water access in perpetuity. Victor Harlan cannot challenge it through the county assessor's office. He would have to bring suit in territorial court, and the confirmation letter makes that suit very unlikely to succeed. Ethan stood very still. It's over, he said. The legal threat is over. Victor Harlan is not over. Men like him don't accept a closed door easily, they look for windows. She tapped the letter. But this removes his strongest weapon. He can't bankrupt you through the assessment process anymore. Whatever he tries next will have to be more direct, and more direct is easier to see coming. Ethan pulled out the chair across from her and sat down heavily, like his legs had simply decided they were done for the moment. He put both hands flat on the table. He looked at the letter. He looked at his hands. I've been fighting that man for 3 years, he said. 3 years of watching him work around me, under me, through every crack he could find. A pause. I didn't know about the 1878 language. You knew your land was yours, Clara said. You just didn't have the vocabulary to say it in a way the county assessor was obligated to hear. He looked up at her. That's a generous way to put it, he said. It's an accurate way to put it, she said. There's a difference between not knowing a thing and being wrong about a thing. A long silence sat between them. Comfortable now, in a way, silences between them hadn't been in those first weeks. Something had changed in the cabin over the past month, something neither of them had named or examined directly, because naming it might have made it fragile, and they were both people who had learned to be careful with fragile things. I need to tell you something, Ethan said. His voice had changed. It had dropped slightly and gone quieter, which Clara had learned meant he was about to say something that cost him. She waited. Before you came, he said, there was someone else, a woman named Ruth. We were engaged. Clara said nothing. She kept her face still. She came out from Billings to see the ranch. This was 2 years before I put the advertisement in the correspondence service. He paused. She saw at the cabin the debt, the land, and she left the next morning. Didn't say much. Didn't have to. His jaw worked once. After that I told myself I wouldn't. I didn't plan to let anyone close enough to be disappointed again. Then I ran out of options, and I sent that letter. Clara looked at him steadily. And you lied in it? Yes. About the ranch being prosperous? Yes. Because you thought if you told the truth, no one would come. I knew no one would come. Clara picked up her pencil, set it down again. She chose her words with the same care she applied to legal documents, precisely without waste. I lied too, she said. Not about my education or my accounts. But capable wife implied things I wasn't capable of when I arrived. I implied competence I had to build after the fact. A pause. We were both desperate people who said what they needed to say to get what they needed to get. I don't think that makes either of us dishonest. I think it makes us human. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. She wasn't wrong, he said finally. Ruth, the ranch it was in worse shape then than now even. She wasn't wrong to leave. She may not have been wrong, Clara said carefully, but I'm not Ruth. Something about that landed differently than she intended, or perhaps exactly as she intended. She wasn't sure herself. She watched it arrive on his face, watched him sit with it. No, he said quietly. You're not. What Victor Harlan tried next came on a Sunday through Eleanor Voss. Clara had just come back from the well. When Eleanor appeared at the ranch road on a bay horse alone, which was unusual enough that Clara set down her water pail and simply waited. Eleanor dismounted. She had the expression of a woman who had decided to do something difficult and was committed to it. Mrs. Cole, she said. Mrs. Voss. Clara gestured toward the porch. Do you want to sit? Eleanor sat. Clara brought coffee. The coffee was good now, consistently good. She had made sure of that, and sat across from her in the other chair. Ethan had brought out 2 weeks ago without being asked, because Clara had mentioned once that she liked the mornings outside, and he had simply appeared with a second chair. I'm going to say something that isn't kind, Eleanor said. And I'm going to say it anyway because I think you have the sense to hear it. All right, said Clara. Victor Harlan is telling people in town that your husband's financial situation is worse than anyone knows. That the bank is about to call the operating loan. That by fall there won't be a coal ranch to speak of. Eleanor held her coffee cup with both hands. He's been talking to the bank president Gerald Mast privately. I know because Gerald's wife is my second cousin, and she has a very thin door between her kitchen and her husband's study. Clara kept her face neutral. Her mind, however, was moving very fast. What specifically is he telling Gerald Mast? She asked. That the ranch is failing, that the land value has been overstated, that... Eleanor paused, and something moved across her face. That wasn't gossip, wasn't cruelty, something closer to reluctant conscience. That you don't exist properly. That Ethan fabricated a wife to make himself look more stable to the bank. The silence was absolute. Clara set her coffee cup down very precisely in the center of her knee. He's telling the bank I'm not real, she said. That you're not legitimately married. That the marriage certificate may be irregular. Eleanor's voice had gone quieter. I know you and I have not been friendly, Mrs. Cole. I said things in Pruitt's store that were unkind, and I said them because I didn't know you yet, and I was repeating things I'd heard. She looked directly at Clara for the first time, without the armor of social disdain. I don't repeat those things anymore. Clara studied her. What changed? Pruitt told me you came in 3 weeks ago and bought a 50-pound sack of flour, 6 pounds of dried beans, and a canning jar set. And that you asked him specifically whether his supplier carried any of the new baking powders out of Chicago because you were trying to improve your yield. Eleanor's mouth moved toward something that wasn't quite a smile. A woman who's trying to improve her baking yield is not a woman who plans to leave. Clara looked at Eleanor Voss. Really looked at her, the way you look at someone once you've stopped measuring them for threat, and saw a woman who had lived in this hard country a long time and made her own accommodations with it. Thank you for coming, Clara said. You didn't have to. No, Eleanor agreed. I didn't. After Eleanor left. Clara sat on the porch alone for a long time. The challenge in her mind had rearranged itself. The legal threat was addressed. Victor Harlan had responded by moving to the bank to the question of the loan to the question of the marriage itself. He was methodical. She was more methodical. When Ethan came in from the south pasture at midday, dusty and tired, Clara was at the table with the marriage certificate, the bank loan document, and a new letter half-drafted in front of her. She told him everything Eleanor had said. His face went through several things in quick succession. Anger, which he controlled. Something that looked briefly like fear, which he controlled faster. And then a kind of cold steadiness that she suspected was what he looked like when he'd decided a thing was a fight, and fights were something he knew how to do. He can't invalidate the marriage, Ethan said. It was filed properly with the county clerk. I know. Our certificate is sound. But what he can do is create enough noise around the legitimacy question that Gerald Mast gets nervous about the loan. Clara tapped her letter. I'm writing to Gerald Mast directly, asking for a meeting, in town, both of us. A meeting at which we bring the marriage certificate, the land office confirmation letter, the ledger I've been keeping for the past 6 weeks, showing the ranch's current income and expenses and trajectory, and ourselves. She looked at him. Together, in a bank president's office, letting him see with his own eyes that we are a real marriage on a functional ranch, with legal rights to the land and water. Harlan wants him to doubt. Ethan looked at the letter, then at her. You've been keeping a ledger, he said, since the 3rd week. I didn't tell you because I wasn't sure it was any good yet. It's good now. Can I see it? She slid it across the table. He opened it. He went through it slowly. The columns she'd set up, the weekly tallies, the note she'd made in the margin, calculating what the ranch would yield if they could bring in 6 more head before winter, and what it would require to do it. He read it with the focused, quiet attention of a man learning something he hadn't known he needed to know. "This is the whole thing," he said. "Everything, all in one place." "It needs to be all in one place," she said. "You can't fight what you can't see clearly." He closed the ledger carefully, pushed it back toward her. "Clara," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name without her prompting it. She looked at him. "This ranch would be gone by now," he said. "Without you, this ranch would be gone." She held his gaze. "This ranch would be gone without both of us," she said. "That's rather the point." The meeting with Gerald Mast was set for the following Thursday. Wednesday night, the drought broke, but not with the gentle rain the valley had been praying for 2 months. It broke with a storm that came in from the northwest, with no courtesy and no warning, turning the sky, a color that had no peaceful name. And Clara woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of the wind doing something to the roof that it had never done before, and Ethan already out of bed and pulling on his boots. "Creak," he said by way of explanation. She was already reaching for her own boots. "Clara." "Don't," she said. He looked at her in the dark. She could feel the look rather than see it, and he didn't argue. He handed her the lantern. Outside was chaos. The rain came sideways, the kind of rain that had no interest in falling down, that drove horizontally into every gap and seam and thought. The creek, which had been running thin and worried all summer, had found its voice in the hours since midnight, and was now announcing itself with considerable authority. Ethan ran toward the lower pasture, and Clara ran behind him. Lantern in one hand, coil of rope in the other, she had grabbed it from the porch hook. By instinct, the way you grabbed things that might matter without stopping to reason through why. The lower fence was already under water at the east post, and in the thin, wavering circle of lantern light, Clara could see Ethan's best cow, the one he'd told her about, the roan heifer he'd been counting on to anchor next year's breeding stock, standing past her hocks in fast-moving water, pressed against the fence line and making a sound that cut right through the noise of the rain. Ethan assessed it in 2 seconds. He started to move. "The fence post will give," Clara shouted over the wind. "If she panics when you get close and hits that post, the whole line goes and you'll lose her in the current." "I know," he shouted back. "Let me come from the other side. I'll keep her head steady while you work the fence." "That water's moving fast." "I can see that, Ethan. Let me come from the other side." He looked at her. Rain running off his hat brim in a solid sheet. Mud to his knees. The cow calling behind him. "Stay out of the deep channel," he said. "Southwest corner's lower, go around." She went. The southwest corner was lower, which meant it was also wetter, and by the time Clara reached the far side of the animal she was in water, past her own knees, and the ground underneath was not agreeing to stay where it was put. She set the lantern on the fence post, the post on her side still holding, and she talked to the cow. She had no idea what she said. The same low, steady patter she'd learned from Ethan in Margaret's stall, the voice that wasn't commanding and wasn't asking, just present. Just there. "I'm here. I'm here. You're all right. Stay still. Stay still." The heifer's head swung toward her voice. Clara reached up and took hold of the halter. On the other side, she could hear Ethan working at the fence, the sound of metal against metal wire under tension, a man fighting a structure that was losing its argument with water and physics simultaneously. The fence post nearest the cow groaned. Clara pulled the halter toward her slowly, steadily, not fighting the animal, negotiating with it, the way she had learned that all things in this territory required negotiation. "Ethan," she called. Almost. The post gave 6 inches. The cow lunged. Clara went down. Not all the way, one knee in the water, the current pulling at her skirt with genuine serious intent. Her grip on the halter. The only thing between the animal's head and the full current of the creek. She wrapped the lead rope around her waist, both hands on the rope dug in planted, and she did not let go. She did not let go. The pain in her hands was its own weather system. The cold of the water was a separate emergency she set aside because there was no room for it yet. "Clara." Ethan's voice close sharp with something she had never heard in it before. "I have her," she shouted. "Get the fence." Get the fence, Ethan." She heard him make a sound that was not a word. She heard him go back to the fence, and she held on in the water and the dark and the rain for the longest 3 minutes of her life. Then the fence gave way cleanly, not collapsing, opened, pulled free on purpose, and Ethan was beside her, his hands over hers on the rope, his weight anchoring next to hers. And together they walked the heifer backward step by step up the slope and out of the water and onto solid ground where the animal stood trembling and breathing hard and alive. Clara's knees gave way. She didn't fall. Ethan's arm came around her before she reached the ground, and she ended up sitting on a fence rail with her feet in the mud and her hair plastered to her face, and rain still driving sideways in the dark. Ethan crouched in front of her. His hands found her face, tilting it up. "Are you hurt?" he said. "I'm cold," she said. "And I'm wet. And my hands hurt." She looked at the heifer standing 10 feet away, shaking herself dry with bovine dignity. "She's all right. Clara." His voice had done something unusual. It had gone rough in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. "We saved her," Clara said. She looked at him. His face was very close in the dark rain, wet and stripped of everything he usually kept between himself and the world. "That's what mattered." "You could have been—" He stopped. "But I wasn't." "You didn't let go." "Of course I didn't let go," she said, and she meant it about more than the rope. He stayed crouched in front of her in the rain for a long moment, his hands still on either side of her face, and something passed between them that was too large and too true to be handled right now, in the dark, in the mud, in the aftermath of surviving something together. Then he straightened up. He pulled her to her feet. He did not let go of her hand for the walk back to the cabin. Neither of them mentioned it. Inside, she changed behind the curtain into dry clothes, with hands that were still shaking from cold and effort. And when she came back out, Ethan had the stove burning and water heating and 2 cups on the table. He had also changed. He was sitting at the table with his elbows on it and his face down in his hands, in the posture of a man who had gone very far inside himself. Clara sat across from him. She waited. After a while, he said, without lifting his head, "Ruth left because of a bad harvest. Not because of the ranch exactly. Because when the harvest failed, I shut down. I went somewhere inside, and I didn't come back out for 3 months. I didn't talk. I didn't explain. I just closed." Clara listened. "I thought that was what I was. That when things got hard, I became someone you couldn't reach." He lifted his head. His eyes were tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "Tonight you were in that water and I needed to, and the only thing I could do was get the fence, because that was what you told me to do. Because I trusted that you knew what you were doing." He said the last part like it surprised him. Like trust applied outward was a muscle he hadn't used in long enough that he'd forgotten he had it. "You did know what you were doing," he said. "You did." "I learned it from you," Clara said. "All of it. Every piece of this I learned from you, or from failing, or from being here. And I'm still learning." She folded her hands around her cup. "Ethan, you didn't shut down tonight. You heard me. You went back to the fence." He looked at her. "That's not nothing," she said quietly. "That's not the man Ruth knew." The fire in the stove pressed warm into the room. Rain still moved across the roof, but gentler now, the storm having said most of what it came to say. Ethan reached across the table and picked up her right hand, the one that had held the rope that still had a red mark across the palm from the coil of it, and he held it in both of his and looked at it without speaking for a long moment. Then he set it down carefully. He stood up. He said, "Get some sleep. We've got the bank meeting tomorrow." "Today," she corrected. "It's past midnight." "Today, then." He moved toward his side of the curtain. Stopped. "Clara," he said without turning. "Yes." "Thank you," he said, "for not letting go." She looked at his back, at the shoulder she had mended that was holding. "That's what I'm here for," she said. He went to bed. Clara sat at the table alone for a while longer, holding her cup with sore hands, listening to the rain saying its last words against the roof, thinking about everything they were going to walk into that bank and say. Tomorrow, thinking about a man who had just said more in 10 minutes than he'd managed in 6 weeks, thinking about a heifer that was alive because two people had refused to let go at the same moment in the same dark water pulling in the same direction. She thought, this is what it is. This is what it actually is. Not the letter, not the promise, not the prosperous ranch or the capable wife or any of the careful fictions they had built around their desperation to make it presentable. This. Mud and cold water and rope burns and a stove going warm in the dark. And a man who once had shut down entirely sitting across from her tonight and choosing visibly with effort against his own long habit to stay open. She picked up her pencil. She finished the letter to Gerald Mast. She made it very good. They rode into Harlan Crossing at 9 in the morning with the marriage certificate, the land office confirmation letter, and Clara's ledger in a leather satchel she held on her lap. Neither of them had slept more than 3 hours. Clara had repinned her hair twice on the road because the wind kept pulling it loose, and her good blue dress, the one she'd arrived in, the one she'd saved for exactly this kind of occasion, had a mud hem she'd scrubbed at 5 in the morning and gotten mostly clean, mostly being the operative word. Her hands still ached from the rope. She held the satchel anyway and kept her back straight and watched the town come toward them through the wagon's rattling progress over the dry road. Ethan drove without speaking. His jaw was set and his eyes were forward, and he had worn his cleanest shirt and his good hat, which told her he understood what today was without her having to explain it. Gerald Mast is going to be polite, Clara said as they came into the edge of town. He'll offer coffee. He'll ask about the ranch in the tone of a man who already knows the answers and is measuring whether you know them too. Don't fill his silences. Let him talk until he's said what he actually thinks, and then we respond to that, not to the polite version. Ethan glanced at her sideways. You've done this before. I sat in 17 creditor meetings with my father over the course of 2 years, Clara said. I learned which silences were offers and which ones were traps. And Mast? I don't know yet. That's what this morning is for. Ethan turned the wagon onto the main street. Clara felt the town notice them the particular quality of attention that a small place gave to something it had opinions about. Two men outside the feed store stopped their conversation. A woman on the far boardwalk turned, and then turned deliberately away, which was its own kind of statement. And then, at the end of the street outside the bank, Clara saw Victor Harlan. He was not going into the bank. He was coming out of it. He saw them at the same moment. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. The wagon kept rolling. The distance closed. Harlan stood on the bank steps with his good coat and his easy smile, and the look of a man who had just had a conversation that pleased him. Clara kept her eyes on him and did not look away. He tipped his hat. She did not acknowledge it, not. Ethan pulled the wagon up in front of the bank. He set the brake. He got down and came around and offered Clara his hand, which he had never done before, not from the wagon, not anywhere. And she understood immediately that it was not gallantry. It was a statement, clear and deliberate, visible to anyone on the street who cared to observe it. This is my wife. This is a real marriage. We are here together. She took his hand and stepped down. Harlan had not moved from the top of the bank steps. Ethan, he said pleasantly. Mrs. Cole, didn't expect to see you in town today. We have a meeting with Gerald Mast, Clara said. Something flickered behind Harlan's easy smile. Very brief. Is that right? It is. She kept walking. Ethan beside her, her hand still in the crook of his arm. Excuse us, Mr. Harlan. They went up the steps and through the bank door, and Harlan was left standing at the top of the steps behind them with his pleasant expression and whatever calculation was running underneath it. Gerald Mast was a compact man in his mid-50s, with wire spectacles and the careful manner of someone who had spent a professional lifetime not saying more than was useful. He shook Ethan's hand first, then Clara's with equal brevity, and he offered coffee, which Clara accepted, and Ethan declined, and he settled them into chairs across from his desk and folded his hands on top of it. Mr. and Mrs. Cole, he said. I understand you wanted to discuss the operating loan. We did, Clara said. Before we do, I'd like to ask you something directly. Mast looked at her with the neutral expression of a man reserving judgment. Has Victor Harlan spoken to you about our ranch in the past month? She asked. A pause, brief but present. Mr. Harlan is a depositor and a business associate of this bank, Mast said carefully. I'm not in a position to discuss private conversations. Mr. Mast, Clara said quietly. I have here our marriage certificate filed properly with the county clerk on July the 8th. I have a letter from the Territorial Land Office in Helena confirming the Cole Ranch's riparian rights under the original 1878 land grant. And I have a ledger showing 6 weeks of ranch operations income, expense, and trajectory. She set each document on his desk as she named it, aligned precisely face up. I'm not asking you to violate a confidence. I'm asking whether there are questions about this ranch's legitimacy or viability that we can address directly right now in this room rather than through intermediaries. Mast looked at the documents. He picked up the Helena letter first, which told her something about what Harlan had been working on. He read it carefully, set it down, picked up the marriage certificate. Ethan sat beside Clara and said nothing. She had asked him for that on the road, let me lead until I signal you otherwise, and he was holding to it with the focused patience of a man who had decided to trust a judgment that wasn't his. Mast set down the certificate and picked up the ledger. I went through it slowly. Clara watched his eyes move across her columns and felt the particular anxiety of having something you've made examined by someone with the authority to find it insufficient. She had checked every number 4 times. She had checked them again at 5 that morning by lamplight. This is your work, Mast said, looking up at her. Yes. You have accounting experience. I managed my father's business accounts in St. Louis for 3 years. She kept her voice even. The format is standard double entry. The figures are current as of this week. Mast set the ledger down. He took off his glasses, polished them, replaced them. Clara recognized the gesture. Her father's creditors had all done some version of it, the small physical ritual of a man reorganizing his thinking. Mr. Harlan came to me, Mast said, with certain representations about the Cole Ranch's situation. He said it carefully, like a man acknowledging the shape of a thing without fully touching it. He expressed concern that the operating loan might be imprudently extended. On what grounds? Ethan said. His voice was controlled, but only just. He suggested the ranch's water access was legally uncertain. He suggested. Mast paused. He raised questions about the nature of the marriage arrangement. Silence. The nature of it, Clara said. He suggested the marriage may have been represented differently to the bank than the actual circumstances warranted. Clara looked at Gerald Mast with the full, steady, clear-eyed composure of a woman who had held a rope in a flooding creek at 2 in the morning and not let go. Mr. Mast, she said, I came here from St. Louis. I came on a train with 1 trunk and 1 hat box and 3 books and less money than I'm comfortable admitting. I came because I answered a correspondence advertisement, and I needed a life, and I was not willing to live on other people's charity. She kept her hands flat on her knees. The man who placed that advertisement did not have a thriving ranch. I did not have a capable wife's skills. We were 2 people who told each other partial truths because we were desperate, and we have spent the past 6 weeks building something real out of what we actually had. She tapped the ledger. That is what we actually have. You can read it. Every number is true. Mast looked at her. He looked at Ethan. He looked at the documents on his desk. The Helena confirmation removes the legal question about the water rights, he said slowly. That was Harlan's strongest argument. Yes, said Clara. It was. Another silence. This one had a different quality, not adversarial. More like a man recalibrating. The ledger shows the ranch is currently operating at a deficit, Mast said. A deficit that has been shrinking by 11% week over week for 5 weeks, Clara said. At current trajectory, we break even before the end of October. If we can bring in 6 additional head of cattle before winter, I've outlined the cost and the projected return on page 4. The spring position is substantially stronger. Mast turned to page 4. He read it. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked up and said, Where did you learn to construct a financial projection? From watching my father lose everything, Clara said. I learned what not to do first. Then I worked backward to what to do instead. Something shifted in Gerald Mast's face, not warmth exactly, but a kind of recognition, one practical person acknowledging another. "I'll need a week to review the loan terms," he said, "but I don't see a basis for calling the note." He picked up the Helena letter once more. "This removes the primary concern I had." Ethan exhaled one slow, controlled breath. Clara felt it beside her like a pressure releasing. "Thank you, Mr. Mast," she said. They were on the bank steps in the full light of morning when Victor Harlan appeared. He had not gone far. He was at the base of the steps, and he had the look of a man who had been waiting with patience he was running out of. "Productive meeting," he said. "Very," said Clara. Ethan said nothing. He had gone very still in the way she had come to recognize, not passive stillness, the other kind, the kind that was making a decision about how much force a situation required. Harlan looked at Ethan. "I want you to know I hold nothing personal against you, Cole. This is business. The creek water doubles the value of my eastern parcel. I intend to have it." "The Territorial Land Office confirmed our rights," Ethan said. "In writing, Gerald Mast has the letter." "Territorial offices make decisions, and territorial offices revise them," Harlan said pleasantly. "I have friends in Helena, Ethan. I've always been patient. You know that." It was said with the tone of a man laying down a card he was confident would win the hand. A long game. Friends in the right places. The implication that the Helena letter was temporary, that everything was temporary when you had enough money and enough patience to outlast it. Clara looked at Victor Harlan and felt something settle in her cold and very clear. "Mr. Harlan," she said, "I want to show you something." She opened the satchel. She took out a folded paper, not the Helena letter, not the deed. A separate document she had placed in the satchel that morning without telling Ethan, because she hadn't been sure she would need it, and she hadn't wanted to explain it unless she did. She unfolded it. "This is a copy of a letter," she said, "written by your hired man Dale Purcell to his brother in Billings, dated 3 weeks ago. His brother's wife is a laundress. She found it in his coat when she was cleaning it, and she thought the contents were concerning enough to share." Clara looked at the letter, then at Harlan. "Mr. Purcell writes in some detail about cutting fence wire on the Cole property at night, about moving fence posts to redirect cattle away from the water source. He mentions being paid for this work, and he mentions specifically who paid him." The color in Victor Harlan's face changed. Ethan turned to look at Clara with an expression she had never seen on him before, a complete unguarded astonishment. Harlan said, "That letter is—" "A copy," Clara said. "The original is in the possession of Eleanor Voss, who is holding it for me. Mrs. Voss has agreed that if the Cole Ranch faces any further interference, legal, financial, or physical, she will take the original to the county sheriff and to the territorial marshal's office in Helena." She folded the copy and put it back in the satchel. "The fence cutting is destruction of private property. The coordination with a bank officer to pressure a loan based on fabricated concerns about a marriage's legitimacy is at minimum an ethics violation that the Territorial Banking Commission would find interesting." She closed the satchel. "I am not a vindictive person, Mr. Harlan. I have no interest in destroying your business or your reputation. What I have is a ranch, a legal marriage, confirmed water rights, and a documented record of your hired man's activities on our property. What you have is a choice about whether this goes further." Victor Harlan stood at the bottom of the bank steps and looked at Clara Whitmore Cole for a long measuring moment. She did not move. She did not look away. She had talked a creditor down from $800 to $450 without losing her temper or her dignity, and this was not even close to the hardest conversation she had ever managed. "Where did you get that letter?" Harlan said. His voice had lost its pleasant quality. "It came to me," Clara said simply. "People talk to women they underestimate. You should account for that in future." Harlan looked at Ethan. Ethan looked back at him without expression. "We're done here, Victor," he said. "Leave our land alone." Something in Harlan's posture changed. Not a collapse, not a surrender, but the subtle shift of a man reevaluating his position and finding it less favorable than he'd believed when he walked up. He was still dangerous. Clara knew that. Men with his resources and his patience were always dangerous. But dangerous and in possession of a clear path forward were two different things, and she had just made the path considerably less clear. He nodded once, tightly. He walked away. Clara let out a breath she had been holding for approximately 4 minutes. Ethan turned to her on the bank steps and said, "The letter from Purcell." "Yes." "How long have you had it?" "Eleanor brought it to me 5 days ago with the other information. I didn't tell you because I wasn't certain it was enough on its own, and I needed to see what Harlan had already told Mast before I decided how to use it." "You were holding it. I was waiting for the right moment." She looked at him steadily. "Was that wrong?" He stood very still. "No," he said. "No, it wasn't wrong." He looked at the end of the street where Harlan had turned the corner and disappeared. "He's not done." "No," Clara agreed. "But he's careful now. Careful men move slower and make fewer mistakes. Slow and careful we can manage." Ethan looked at her. The morning light was full on his face, and he wasn't managing his expression the way he usually did, and she could see everything in it. The exhaustion, the relief, the thing underneath both of those that he hadn't said directly, and she hadn't asked him to. "You knew," he said. "Walking into that bank this morning. You knew you had Purcell's letter." "Yes." "And you still went through all of it, the ledger, the Helena letter, the explanation to Mast without using it. Because I needed Mast to see the ranch on its own merits first," she said. "The letter is leverage against Harlan. Mast needed evidence, not leverage. They're different tools." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Clara," he said. "Yes." "I owe you something." She waited. "I should have told you the truth in that letter," he said. "About the ranch. About everything. You deserve to make an informed choice." "You needed someone who would come," she said. "That doesn't make it right." "No," she agreed. "It doesn't. But Ethan." She looked at him directly in the full street in the morning light, with 3 women she recognized from the general store watching from the far boardwalk, and not bothering to pretend they weren't. "I came here with my own lies and my own desperation and my own things I needed. I wasn't honest either. We were even." A pause. "What we are now is something else." "What are we now?" he asked quietly. It was not a challenge. It was a man who genuinely wanted to know who was asking, because he trusted her answer. Clara considered it. "Partners," she said. "Real ones. The kind that hold the rope when the water rises." Something broke open in his face. Not dramatically, it wasn't that kind of man, and this wasn't that kind of moment. Just a quiet opening like a door that had been stuck for a long time, finally moving on its hinges. "That'll do," he said softly. The 3 women on the far boardwalk were Eleanor Voss, Mrs. Pruitt, and a younger woman Clara didn't know. Eleanor gave her a single nod, small and deliberate. Clara nodded back. Then Ethan touched her elbow and said, "There's something else we need to do while we're in town." She looked at him. He walked her down the street to Pruitt's general store, pushed the door open, and went in. Mr. Pruitt looked up from behind the counter. There were 4 other people in the store. 2 men loading a feed order. The younger woman who'd been with Eleanor on the boardwalk, having apparently moved fast, and a man Clara recognized as one of the town's 2 lawyers browsing the stationery. Ethan stopped in the middle of the store. "I want to say something," he said to the room in general, in the voice he used when he'd decided something was going to be said, and the discomfort of saying it was not going to be a factor. The store went quiet. "My wife came here from St. Louis on a correspondence advertisement. I wrote that advertisement, and I told it plain enough to get someone to answer, but not plain enough to be entirely honest about the situation she was walking into." He didn't look away from the center of the room. Didn't address anyone specifically, just said it into the air where everyone could take their share of it. Clara came to a broken-down ranch with a half-empty pantry, and a man who hadn't talked to anyone in years, and she didn't leave. She learned this land from the ground up. She saved my cattle, she defended my legal rights, and she kept my books better than I've ever kept them myself. A pause. Anyone in this town has treated her with anything less than the respect owed to a woman who's done all that I'm asking you to think again. The silence in Pruitt's general store lasted for 4 full seconds. Then Mr. Pruitt said slowly and clearly, "Mrs. Cole, can I set aside those baking powders you asked about from Chicago? Just came in on Wednesday's delivery." Clara's throat did something she hadn't given it permission to do. "Yes," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Pruitt." The younger woman. "Clara didn't know," said Mrs. Cole. "I'm Jenny Alderman. My husband works the North Grazing Land. I've been meaning to introduce myself for weeks. I'd like to, if that's all right." "I'd like that very much," Clara said. The lawyer at the stationery counter looked up from his browsing, met Ethan's eyes and nodded once. Not effusive. Just acknowledgement, the currency that men in hard places exchanged when words cost more than they wanted to spend. Ethan nodded back. Clara stood in the middle of Pruitt's general store, with her mud-hemmed dress, and her rope-burned hands, and everything she had built in 6 weeks of failing and trying and refusing to stop. And she felt for the first time since she'd stepped off that train that she was standing on solid ground. Not the ground of the ranch, she had found her footing there already. This was different. This was the ground of being known. Of having someone stand in front of other people and say, "This woman is real, what she has done is real, treat her accordingly." She had not known she needed that until she had it. On the ride home, Ethan handed her the reins at a flat stretch of road and reached into his coat pocket. He set something on the wagon bench between them. It was a small packet of vanilla extract, the kind she'd asked Pruitt about weeks ago that he'd said he might be able to get in from Chicago. She looked at it. "Pruitt gave it to me 2 days ago," Ethan said. "Said you'd been asking. I forgot I had it in my coat." Clara picked up the vanilla extract. She turned it over in her sore hands. "You went and got this for me," she said. "Pruitt just set it aside when it came in." "Ethan." She looked at him. "You went and picked it up." He kept his eyes on the road. The back of his neck went slightly darker. "Your bread's better with vanilla," he said. "I noticed." Clara held the small bottle and looked at the road unrolling ahead of them, and felt something so full and quiet in her chest that she had no immediate name for it. It was not fireworks. It was not the language of the romantic letters she had once read by lamplight in Dorothea's apartment, dreaming of something easier than this. It was a man who noticed what she needed and went to get it without ceremony or announcement. It was a bottle of vanilla extract. It was everything. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, took the reins back. They drove home on a road that was the same road it had always been, rough, dry, the kind of road that made your teeth rattle and your back ache. And it looked entirely different to Clara than it had that first day when she'd ridden it trying to catalog her disaster. The cabin was there when they came around the last bend, leaning slightly, as it always had, the patched oilcloth window, and the imperfect door, and the porch, with its one broken step that they'd been meaning to fix for 3 weeks. It was not what she had expected. It was what she had built. Ethan set the brake. He got down. He came around the wagon and offered her his hand the same way he had outside the bank, deliberate, clear, and she took it. And when she was down, he didn't immediately let go. He stood there holding her hand in the dirt in front of their imperfect cabin, and looked at her the way she had wanted someone to look at her for a very long time, like she was the most real thing in his world, and he intended to keep her that way. "Clara," he said. "Yes," she said. "I didn't say anything else." He didn't have to. He raised her hand, the rope-burned one, the one that had held the line, and pressed it briefly firmly against his chest, where she could feel his heart going at a rate that matched her own. Then he let go. He turned to unhitch the horse. Clara stood in the dirt and pressed her hand flat against her own chest, feeling what was there. Real, she thought. All of it finally real. She went inside to start the bread. The bread with vanilla sold out in 40 minutes. It had been Eleanor Voss's idea. Or rather, it had been Eleanor's offhand comment 2 weeks after the bank meeting that the Harvest Festival committee was short, a baker said in the tone of a woman who had already decided the answer and was being polite about the asking. Clara had agreed before she fully thought it through, which was how she found herself at 4 in the morning. 3 Saturdays later, standing at the stove, she now knew as well as she knew her own hands, producing 12 loaves of vanilla-scented bread and 6 dozen biscuits for the Harlan Crossing harvest table. Ethan had gotten up at 4 with her without being asked. He didn't bake. He wasn't going to start. But he kept the fire fed and the coffee coming, and he loaded the wagon when everything was wrapped and ready, and he drove her into town in the gray pre-dawn without a word of complaint, which she had come to understand was its own language, fluent and complete. The festival was set up in the open ground behind the feed store tables. A fiddle player, the accumulated noise of a small town, having decided to be cheerful about the harvest, despite the summer's drought, having made cheerful a complicated position. Clara set up her table beside Eleanor Voss's preserves and Jenny Alderman's pie, and felt the difference in the way people moved around her, now the space they made the greetings they offered. Not warmth exactly. Not yet with most of them. But acknowledgement. The basic social currency of you are here, and you belong here, that she had not felt on the main street of Harlan Crossing, until Ethan had stood up in Pruitt's store and said what he said. She had not stopped being grateful for that. By mid-morning, the bread was gone. By noon, 2 different women had asked her for the recipe, which she gave freely because her mother's cook had given it to her freely, and because hoarding a bread recipe in a frontier town where women needed every good tool they could get seemed to Clara like a fundamental misunderstanding of how survival worked. She was wrapping the empty baskets when she heard the voice. "You must be the mail-order bride." She turned. The woman standing at the edge of her table was perhaps 45, well-dressed for Harlan Crossing with sharp eyes, and the particular composure of someone who had lived long enough to stop apologizing for being direct. Clara did not recognize her. "I'm Clara Cole," she said. "And you are?" "Margaret Purcell," the woman said. "Dale Purcell's mother." The name landed like a stone in still water. Clara set down her basket carefully. "Mrs. Purcell, I know about the letter," the woman said. "The one my daughter-in-law found. The one you used against Harlan." She wasn't hostile. Clara realized that, reading her expression with the attention she now applied to every face that came at her with complicated intent. She was something more like tired. "I want you to know that Dale has left Harlan's employment. He left the week after your meeting at the bank." Clara looked at her steadily. "I'm glad to hear it. He's not a bad man," Mrs. Purcell said. "He made a bad choice for money he needed badly. There's a difference." "Yes," Clara said. "There is. I know something about making imperfect choices under pressure." She paused. "The letter served its purpose. I have no interest in using it further." Mrs. Purcell studied her for a long moment. Whatever she was measuring, Clara apparently met the standard because the woman nodded. Once the same kind of nod Eleanor had given her the frontier economy of respect and said, "Your bread is the best thing at this table. My compliments," and walked away. Clara stood alone at her empty table and breathed through the complicated feeling of a confrontation that had arrived, resolved, and departed in under 3 minutes, leaving her with the odd sensation that the territory around them was slowly, piece by piece, making its peace with their presence. Ethan found her at the edge of the festival grounds an hour later, standing apart from the crowd with her face toward the mountains. "Purcell's mother came to see me," Clara said before he could ask. "I know, I saw." He came to stand beside her. "You all right?" "I'm fine." She wasn't hostile. She just wanted me to know Dale had left Harlan's service. Clara looked at the mountains. "I think she wanted absolution a little, for her son." "Did you give it?" I told her the truth, that there's a difference between a bad man and a man who made a bad choice. She paused. "I believe that." Ethan was quiet beside her. Then he said, "Harlan was at the north edge of the grounds this morning, early before most people arrived. I saw him talking to Pete Garver." Clara turned to look at him. Pete Garver owned the grazing land north of Harlan's parcel. She had learned the geography of this county's land ownership over the past 2 months. The way she had learned the stove methodically, thoroughly, because you could not manage what you did not understand. "What kind of talking?" she asked. "The kind with papers," Ethan said. She thought about that. "He's shifting the play," she said. "If he can't get our water through legal pressure or bank pressure, he'll try to consolidate the land around us instead. Box us in. Make the ranch's future limited, even if its present is secure." "Can he do that?" "He can try." She turned back toward the festival, making her calculation. "We need to be ahead of it. I want to write to the Territorial Land Office again this time, not about our deed, but about any pending land transfer applications in the county. Public record. We're entitled to see them." Ethan looked at her sideways. "You're always 3 steps ahead of the problem." "Someone has to be," she said. "You're better at the immediate emergency. I'm better at the one that's coming. She glanced at him. Together we cover most of the ground. He looked at her, the way he'd been looking at her more often lately, openly, without the careful management he used to apply to his own face. It still landed on her with the same weight every time, that unguarded attention from a man who had spent years believing nobody worth looking at would stay long enough to be looked at. Together, he said quietly. Not a question. Together, she said. Firm. Clear. No room for doubt in it. He held her gaze for a moment, then looked back at the mountains. But she felt his hand find hers at their sides, his fingers closing around hers, with the same deliberate quiet he brought to everything that mattered to him. They stood like that for a while, not speaking in the thin autumn light, while the fiddle played behind them, and the town moved through its harvest day around them, and the mountains stood where they had always stood, indifferent to everything and present through all of it. The letter from Dorothea arrived in October. It was the first communication Clara had received from St. Louis since a brief note she'd sent 3 weeks after her arrival. Terse, informative, deliberately not asking for anything, and it sat on the table for 2 days before she opened it, because she needed to be in the right frame of mind, which meant a frame of mind from which Dorothea's particular brand of concerned condescension could not reach anything vital. She opened it on a Tuesday morning while Ethan was in the south pasture. Dorothea had written 3 pages. Clara read them with the focused attention she brought to legal documents and found the following. Her cousin was well. Her cousin's husband's business was struggling. The apartment was cramped. 2 paragraphs of St. Louis gossip about people Clara had not thought of in months. A passage carefully constructed. Dorothea was not stupid, expressing concern for Clara's well-being, and wondering whether the marriage had proven satisfactory, and whether Clara might consider returning to St. Louis if circumstances warranted. And then, at the bottom of the 3rd page, almost as a postscript, Father Whitmore's old business partner, Mr. Aldrich, has expressed interest in your whereabouts. He seems to believe there may be a small matter of inheritance from your father's estate that was not properly settled. I thought you should know. Clara read that last paragraph 4 times. Then she put the letter down and sat very still for approximately 60 seconds. Her father had died 14 months ago. The estate had been dissolved to pay creditors. She had believed that entirely because she had seen the accounting herself, had sat in those 17 meetings and watched the numbers go from inadequate to catastrophic to 0. There had been nothing left. If Aldrich believed otherwise, then either he was mistaken, or there was something that had not surfaced in those meetings. Her mind ran the possibilities with the speed she had developed from 2 years of managing her father's collapsing affairs. The most likely explanations in order: a clerical error in the estate settlement, a debt owed to her father that had gone uncollected, a small asset that had been overlooked in the dissolution accounting. Any of these was possible. None of them were likely to amount to much. But not likely was not the same as nothing. When Ethan came in at midday, she showed him the letter. She watched him read it and watched his face process it. The care he took now, reading things that mattered, where 6 weeks ago he would have handed them back to her unread. Aldrich, he said. You know him. My father's business partner for 15 years. I don't trust him entirely. I never did, but he's not a dishonest man. If he's reaching out, he believes there's something there. How much are we talking about? I have no idea. Could be $50. Could be nothing by the time the lawyers finish with it. She looked at him directly. I'm telling you because it involves money, and this is our ranch, and you deserve to know everything that might affect it. He set the letter down. He looked at her. Our ranch, he said. Yes. You didn't say my inheritance, because if there's anything there, it belongs to both of us. Same way the land office letter belongs to both of us. Same way the ledger does. She kept her eyes level. We're not keeping separate accounts, Ethan. That's not how this works. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Write to Aldrich. I intend to. I'll write to the estate court in St. Louis as well directly and ask for a copy of the final settlement accounting. I want to see the numbers myself before I trust anyone else's summary of them. Of course you do, he said. And there was something in his voice that was not quite amusement and not quite admiration, but lived between them, the warm recognition of a man who had come to know exactly how her mind worked and found it without reservation a thing he was glad of. Tucker. She wrote both letters that afternoon and sent them with the next outgoing mail. The response from the estate court came first 3 weeks later. Clara read the account with the attention she had once given to her father's creditor files and found what she was looking for on page 7, a property note originally owed to her father's company that had been listed in the settlement as uncollectible and therefore excluded from the dissolution total. The debtor had been a St. Louis warehouse owner named Carver. The amount $412, not a fortune, not life-changing, but $412 in 1886 Montana Territory on a ranch that was slowly finding its feet was 6 additional head of cattle and a new plow and a winter's worth of supplies without the careful rationing that had governed every meal since she'd arrived. Aldrich's letter came the following week. He had it turned out tracked down Carver and collected the debt, not for his own benefit. He was at pains to explain, but because he had felt the obligation to Clara's father's estate remained open, and he had the time and the connections to pursue it. The money minus his modest commission was held in a St. Louis bank account in her name. He needed her instruction on where to send it. Clara sat at the table with both letters in front of her and let herself feel the full remarkable fact of it for about 30 seconds. Then she picked up her pencil and wrote back with the banking information and the instruction to wire the funds. She was still at the table when Ethan came in from the east pasture with mud on his boots and a question in his eyes that he was managing not to ask out loud. She looked up at him. $412, she said. Minus Aldrich's commission. Call it $380. Ethan's face did the thing where it went very still before it could do anything else. That's real, he said. Very real. It'll be wired within the month. She tapped her pencil on the table. I want to use 120 of it for the 6 head of cattle I projected in the October ledger. The yield calculation holds. If we bring them in before the first hard freeze, they'll be in condition for spring. He sat down across from her. And the rest. The roof on the east side needs proper repair before deep winter. That's $40, maybe $50 if we do the labor ourselves and just buy the materials. The remainder, she paused. I'd like to keep as a reserve, a real one. Not an emergency fund because everything's an emergency. A proper operating reserve. Ethan looked at her. You've already worked out the whole thing. I've been thinking about it since I read the estate letter, she admitted. When was that? This morning. He shook his head slowly, not in disagreement, in something warmer than that. Clara Whitmore Cole, he said. You are the most methodical woman I have ever encountered in my life. Is that a complaint? It is absolutely not a complaint. He reached across the table and picked up the estate letter, reading it for himself with the care he now brought to all the documents she shared with him, and she watched him read it and thought about how different this was from those first weeks when he had handed everything back to her, as though numbers and language were a country he didn't have a passport for. He had a passport now. She had taught him to read the ledger, not accounting exactly, but the logic of it, the shape of what the numbers were saying. He had taught himself the rest, the way he taught himself everything stubbornly quietly at night by lamplight, refusing to be behind on his own ranch's finances. $380, he said, setting the letter down. Give or take. That's more money than I've had liquid since I bought the property. He looked at her. It came from your family. It came from my father's uncollected debts and my mother's business partner's conscience, she said. And it's ours. Don't make it complicated. He looked at her for a long moment. It's not complicated, he said. It's the first time in 4 years something has gone right, and I'm taking a moment to notice it. Clara felt her chest do the thing it did when he said something true without calculation. She held it carefully. Notice it, she said. Then let's go buy some cattle. They brought in 8 head instead of 6. Ethan found 2 additional animals at a price he couldn't justify refusing, and Clara looked at the numbers twice, confirmed the math, and told him to buy them. He looked startled not by the decision, but by the speed of it, by the absence of the long deliberation he'd expected. You're sure, he said. The marginal cost is $22, and the projected return difference is $60 across the spring season, she said. Yes, I'm sure. Buy the cattle, Ethan. He bought the cattle. The 8 new animals came onto the property on a cold November morning, and Clara stood at the fence and watched them move across the pasture toward the water. Their water confirmed, legally established, defended, and felt something so uncomplicated and complete that she almost didn't trust it. She trusted it anyway. The first hard freeze came 10 days later, which was when the roof held or didn't, and it held. The repair had taken 3 days, Ethan on top, and Clara below, handing materials up with a system they'd worked out through argument and adjustment, and the particular negotiation of two people learning each other's methods. And the result was not beautiful, but it was sound. And when the freeze came, the cabin stayed warm, and the ceiling stayed dry, and that was all a roof needed to do. The pantry was full. Genuinely full, not the anxious fullness of a depleted space restocked just enough to get through, but the real fullness of a household that had planned for winter and executed the plan. Clara's preserves were lined up on the new shelves Ethan had built along the north wall. 3 shelves now, not one. The first rough shelf that had held her books expanded into a proper storage wall that he'd added to over the course of the fall, without announcement, appearing one evening with more lumber and working through the weekend until it was done. She had not said, "You built this for me." That was not the language they used. She had said, "The middle shelf needs to be 6 inches higher to fit the tall jars." He had adjusted it without comment. The next evening it was 6 inches higher. That was how they worked. Victor Harlan made one more move. It came in December through the county commissioner's office, a formal request for a resurvey of the eastern boundary of the Cole property, filed on the grounds that the original 1878 survey markers could not be reliably located. It was carefully documented technically within Harlan's rights as an adjacent landowner to request. Clara had the response drafted within 48 hours. She wrote to the county commissioner with the survey details from the original deed, attached the Helena confirmation letter, and noted that the Cole Ranch had already engaged the Territorial Land Office in the matter of the property's legal standing, and that any resurvey conducted without notification to the Territorial Office would be procedurally irregular and potentially challengeable. She copied the letter to the Territorial Land Office directly and noted the resurvey request in her correspondence log. Then she wrote a separate private letter to Eleanor Voss, informing her of the development and asking her to keep the Purcell letter available. Eleanor wrote back in 2 days. "Still here. So is the letter. Let him try." The resurvey request was quietly withdrawn 3 weeks later. Ethan found out about all of it when Clara showed him her correspondence log, the complete record of every letter she had sent and received since arriving at the ranch, organized chronologically and cross-referenced by subject. He stared at it for a long time. "You've been keeping this since when?" he said. "Since the 3rd week," she said. "I didn't mention it because I wasn't sure how much of it would matter." It all mattered. He turned the pages slowly. His name appeared throughout in letters she had written on his behalf, in records of conversations she had documented, because she had learned early that conversations without records were just noise in a dispute. "Clara," he said. "Yes." "When you walked off that train," he said slowly, "in your blue dress, with your trunk and your hat box and your 3 books." He looked up at her. "Did you know that you could do all of this?" She considered the question honestly. "No," she said. "I knew I wasn't useless. I knew I could think and write and manage numbers. I didn't know what that was worth out here until I found out what out here needed." She paused. "I didn't know I could milk a cow either. Margaret has a different opinion of me now." Something broke across his face that was entirely undisguised, warmth and amusement, and something deeper under both of them. Something she had watched build in him all these months, the way the ledger had built line by careful line into something that had weight and shape, and could hold what was put into it. He stood up from the table. He crossed to her side of it. He stood in front of her and took her face in his hands, both of them careful as he handled everything that mattered to him, and he said, "I need to say something." "All right," she said. "I wrote that letter because I was out of options, and I was too proud to ask anyone for help, and I thought if I got a wife at least, I'd have someone to help me keep the place running." He held her face steady. "I did not write that letter thinking I would—" He stopped. Tried again. "I did not write it thinking the person who answered would become the thing I can't imagine this without." Clara held very still. "The thing," she said carefully. Yubi said. I can't imagine this without you. Not the ranch, not the cattle, not the letters and the ledger and the fights with Harlan. You. He searched her face. I know that's not what you came here for. I know you came here because you needed somewhere to land. And if that's all this is... Ethan, she said. He stopped. Do you remember the night of the flood? She said. Yes, I was in that water, and I had the rope around my waist, and the current was pulling, and I had one thought. She reached up and covered one of his hands with hers. I thought I am not letting go of this. I was thinking about the cow. She held his gaze. I was also not thinking about the cow. Something shifted in his breathing. Clara, he said. I didn't come here for love, she said. I came here because I had nothing left, and I refused to give up. But this... She pressed his hand against her face. This is not nothing. This has not been nothing for a very long time. He kissed her. Not dramatically. Not the way letters described it. Not the language of the romantic novels she had read in Dorothea's apartment, dreaming of something easier than real life. It was the way he did everything that mattered quietly with full attention without performance, leaving no room for doubt about whether he meant it. She kissed him back the same way. The sign went up on a Saturday in February. Ethan had made it from a good piece of oak he'd been saving. She didn't know for what. He hadn't said. And he'd worked on it 3 evenings running at the table after supper while she read aloud from her books and pretended not to watch him work. He had decent hands. She had discovered this about him over the months that he made things carefully and well, that the shelf and the fence repair and the roof had all been built to last, not just to serve the immediate need. The sign was no different. He mounted it on the gatepost on a cold, clear February morning, and Clara stood in the yard with her coat and her good boots, and Margaret's opinion on the matter echoing from the barn, and she watched him drive the last nail and step back. Cole and Whitmore Ranch. Both names. Equal size. Neither above the other. She looked at it for a long moment. Whitmore, she said. Your name, he said. Yours before it was mine. It stays. She looked at the sign. At the gate. At the land beyond it. Their land, their water. Their 8 new cattle moving in the far pasture. Their south fence repaired their roof sound, their pantry full. I burned your biscuits the first night, she said. You burned them black, he agreed. I told you they were terrible. You did. And you ate them anyway. They were what there was, he said. He came to stand beside her looking at the sign. And you were what there was. And it turned out. He paused in the way he paused when he was choosing words that cost him something. It turned out what there was enough. More than enough. Clara looked at the sign that had both their names on it in equal letters on good oak that would last. She thought about the train platform, and the mud-splashed wagon, and the black biscuits, and the flooding creek, and the bank president's office, and the ledger, and the rope, burns on her hands, and the vanilla extract, and a man who had built her a shelf without being asked, and driven her to town in the dark, and stood up in a general store and told the truth. She thought about all the things she had come here without knowing how to do, and all the things she knew how to do now, and the difference between the woman who had stepped off that train in her last good dress, and the woman standing in this yard on this February morning, with sore capable hands, and a full pantry, and a correspondence log, and a ranch that had both their names on the gate. She had not come here for this. She had built this out of what she had, with what she found beside the person she had not expected. That was not a consolation prize. That was the whole story. Come inside, she said. I'll make breakfast. She turned for the cabin. He fell into step beside her. And the sign with both their names caught the morning light and held it the way good wood holds what it's given without fuss, without failure, for as long as it takes. That was enough. That was everything. That was real.